I had just finished a morning shift at the small diner on the outskirts of Chicago when my phone started buzzing nonstop in my pocket. My best friend, who still lived in our hometown in rural Missouri, kept sending me frantic messages about something going on at the old family farm I'd inherited from my grandfather. I felt my stomach knot up before I even had a chance to check the details. Then, I saw his actual words. "You need to come back ASAP. They're putting up houses on your land. Something big is going on." For a second, I thought he must be pulling my leg. Who would dare to build anything on my private property without permission? And why hadn't I heard about it sooner? But there was a knot in my chest that told me he wasn't joking. My mind rushed back to all the half-forgotten memories of that place. The old farmhouse with peeling paint, the rickety barn out in the back, and the rolling fields that had been part of my family's heritage for generations. As soon as I realized this was a genuine crisis, I bought a bus ticket. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. I grew up in a small Missouri town where everyone knew everyone else's name, and they usually also knew everyone else's business. The old farm had once belonged to my grandfather, who cherished it with a kind of gentle pride. He would often talk about how that land was more than just dirt and grass. He believed it held some spiritual significance in our family line, like it was a living memory of our ancestors. Although I left for Chicago to carve out my own path, I always understood how important the farm was to him, and by extension to me. After he passed away, I was informed through his will that I was the sole inheritor of that property. At the time, I was busy focusing on building a new life in the city, so I barely visited, aside from occasional short trips. Still, in my heart, I always pictured that land as it had been, untouched and serene. No matter how many times I tried to justify staying put in Chicago, ignoring the farmland and letting it be, I couldn't just sit there once I realized someone was building on my land. I decided to call my friend back for more details. He gave me an earful about how the local Homeowners Association, something I had never paid much attention to, was behind a massive new housing development project. They'd started construction on a few empty fields that everyone believed were up for sale, but he had strong reasons to believe they were actually on my property. The HOA is known around here for pushing boundaries, he warned, and their current president, Diane, is the worst of them all. She's got connections with local officials, real estate big shots, and just about anyone in power. People are terrified to cross her. I felt my blood start to boil. The land was legally mine, and if they were building anything on it, they had to have my permission. How on earth did Diane or anyone else pull that off? Without hesitating, I quit my job at the diner that same afternoon, packed a single duffel bag, and hopped on the evening bus that would take me all the way to my hometown. It was a long, sleepless ride. My mind kept racing, imagining the worst possible scenarios. An entire row of cookie-cutter suburban homes sprawled across my family's farmland, or bulldozers tearing through the grove of trees where I used to collect fireflies. There was a little part of me that felt a flicker of guilt for not having been there. Had I missed some important official letter? Or had Diane and her associates manipulated the legal system in some underhanded way? My grandfather had always been careful with official documents, though. He used to say, "Never let anybody trick you out of what's rightfully yours." He was too meticulous to let that happen by mistake. So, the fact they were building this quickly, especially a large-scale project, made me think something fishy was going on. The instant I arrived in town, I could sense the tension. The local diner was buzzing with gossip, and I heard my name mentioned in hushed tones as I walked past. It felt unsettling, as if I'd suddenly become a local celebrity for all the wrong reasons. I caught a ride with my friend out to the farm, and what I saw made my heart drop. Instead of the quiet open field I remembered, there were rows of half-finished houses, all sporting nearly identical designs, pale siding, neat little windows, and neatly paved driveways. Based on the scale of it, I guessed it had to be around 90 or more houses going up. Later on, I'd learned the exact number was 96, which felt like a sick joke, considering it wasn't even their property to begin with. I marched out into the construction zone with my friend trailing behind me and started shouting for someone in charge. Workers in hard hats stopped what they were doing to stare, clearly confused. Eventually, one of the site managers stepped forward, a clipboard in hand. He tried to calm me down and said something about having all the right permits from the county, the local planning board, and especially the HOA that financed part of the project. I could barely keep my voice steady as I replied, "That can't be possible. This is my land. Nobody asked for my approval." He flipped through his papers and said, "Ma'am, I've got official coordinates and deeds referencing the local HOA's ownership. Are you sure you own it?" The question stung like a slap in the face. Of course I was sure. It was in my grandfather's will. But for the first time, a trickle of doubt seeped in. Could there have been a mistake? I had no choice but to head straight to the county recorder's office. This small brick building in the heart of town was where all property deeds and surveys were filed. The clerk, an elderly man who remembered my grandfather, frowned when he typed my name into the system. "Your grandfather's land deed is right here," he said, turning the computer screen toward me. "But there's a second file that indicates a portion of it was sold to the Glendale Park Homeowners Association about 6 months ago." 6 months ago, I was definitely not the one who sold anything. My face must have been a storm cloud of confusion and anger because the clerk quickly added, "Look, there must be a mistake. I've known your family for decades. Let me see the survey line." He printed out a series of documents showing boundary lines. According to these new records, a massive chunk of my farmland now belonged to the HOA. However, the descriptions were suspiciously vague, referencing an older boundary line that didn't match the official records I remembered seeing in my grandfather's papers. Something about the entire setup smelled rotten. I told the clerk I needed copies of everything, and I filed an urgent request to put a hold on any further transfers of the property. Then I hurried over to the local courthouse to inquire about halting construction. The clerk there explained I'd need a formal court order and would likely have to hire a lawyer if I wanted to place an injunction on the building project. I walked out onto the steps of that courthouse with a sense of dread, trying to figure out my next move. Meanwhile, word about my return was spreading through the town like wildfire, and it wasn't long before I got a phone call from Diane herself. Diane's voice over the phone was sharp and condescending. She introduced herself as the president of the Glendale Park HOA, emphasizing how important her position was in the community. Then she cut straight to the point. "I understand you have some questions about the new development. Let me clarify. This land belongs to the Glendale Park HOA. We have the legal documents to prove it. I'm sorry for your confusion." It was that last line that made my blood boil. She sounded so smug, as if I was just a clueless outsider meddling in her well-laid plans. I took a deep breath and said, "I have the rightful deed to this entire property. I inherited it from my grandfather. I'll see you in court if I have to." She paused for a moment, then gave a low chuckle that sent chills down my spine. "Good luck with that," she said. "You'll find the courts aren't always as sympathetic as you think. Perhaps you should just let this go. It would be easier on everyone." With that, she hung up. I couldn't stand the idea of letting them get away with this. So I decided to go back to the farmhouse itself to see if there was anything of my grandfather's that could help me. The house had been locked up for a while, but I still had the old keys on my ring. Inside, the air smelled musty and stale. Dust motes drifted lazily in the weak afternoon sunlight. I wandered from room to room, fighting a wave of nostalgia, memories of my grandfather teaching me how to fix a squeaky screen door, or the two of us sitting at the kitchen table, laughing over a plate of fresh-baked cookies flooded my mind. But I didn't have time to get lost in the past. I needed answers. I recalled that my grandfather had a habit of hiding important papers in unlikely places, usually to keep them safe from prying eyes. Once, when I was a kid, I found an old tin box filled with precious family photos under a loose floorboard in the living room. Inspired by that memory, I started tapping around the house, trying to find another secret cache. Sure enough, in his bedroom closet, beneath a stack of musty blankets, I found an aged metal box with a simple padlock on it. Fortunately, the old man had stashed a small ring of keys next to it. My hands trembled slightly as I unlocked it, unsure of what I might find. Inside there was a small leather-bound notebook and a bundle of folded papers. The notebook contained pages of my grandfather's handwriting, speaking of the property boundaries, a set of old survey maps, and references to an even older deed. One passage read, "I suspect the HOAs will expand someday. Keep an eye on them, as they might try to claim more land than they pay for." Another entry mentioned that if anything ever happened to him, or if there was a dispute, I should look for the old boundary markers by the creek. It was clear he had anticipated a scenario where someone would try to cheat our family out of the farmland. This was exactly the kind of evidence I needed to prove that those new records at the county office were either forged or based on faulty data. My grandfather was no fool. He must have known someone would eventually test his resolve or try to push the property lines. He had laid the groundwork for me to fight back. The next day I found myself trudging through knee-high grass at the edge of the property near the creek. My friend and I searched for those boundary markers my grandfather had mentioned. Eventually, hidden behind wild overgrowth, we discovered an iron stake driven into the ground. The stake had my grandfather's initials welded onto it. A few feet away was another marker, older and more rusted, but similarly positioned. These markers were nowhere near the lines indicated on that suspicious set of documents at the county recorder's office. It was the smoking gun, concrete proof of the legitimate boundary. I snapped photos, took measurements, and made sure to note the GPS coordinates. If this wasn't enough to raise serious doubts about the HOA's claim, I didn't know what would be. Unfortunately, when I tried to present this evidence to the county officials, I ran into a bureaucratic nightmare. They insisted that to update the official records, I would need a new professional survey plus a judge's sign-off. In the meantime, the building project was forging ahead at a breakneck pace. There was a rumor going around that Diane had friends on the planning board, and that explained why they were allowing construction to move faster than normal. The idea that these homes could be nearly finished before I could even prove they were illegally placed on my land was terrifying. It felt like the deck was stacked against me from every angle, but I also believed that my grandfather's records, combined with a legitimate survey, would be enough to stop them. Determined not to be bullied, I hired an attorney named Marta Davis, a local woman with a fierce reputation. She listened carefully as I laid out the entire situation, from the day I got the text message to the phone call with Diane to the documents I'd found in the farmhouse. Martha's eyes glinted with resolve. "I've butted heads with Diane before," she said. "She's used to throwing her weight around, but she's not invincible. If we have tangible proof, we can get an injunction." She explained that the best immediate step was to file for a temporary restraining order against further construction, at least until a court could look over all the evidence. We drew up the papers that same afternoon. Within days, the legal chess match began. Diane and her HOA associates tried to bury me in motions, claiming that my ownership was invalid, that the land's boundaries had been surveyed incorrectly, and that the sale had been entirely above board. It was infuriating, especially when I started noticing weird problems at the farmhouse. The water got shut off, then the electricity mysteriously went out, leaving me in the dark. When I called the utility companies, they said the accounts had been closed due to non-payment. That made 0 sense. I'd never missed a payment since the utilities had been switched to my name, and I had the bank statements to prove it. It was obvious Diane's network of influence was broader than I had imagined. The situation went from bad to worse when I received a notice taped to my front door. Apparently, the farmhouse was in violation of several local housing ordinances. The structure was considered unsafe, and I was given 10 days to vacate. This was mind-boggling because, aside from needing some maintenance, the house was perfectly livable. Friends started whispering about how Diane might have used her contacts at the county building inspection department to harass me, hoping I'd leave so they could continue building without interference. In response, I set up a temporary generator for power and moved in a few supportive neighbors who were willing to house sit whenever I had to leave. We all understood that if the place was abandoned, something suspicious might happen. Maybe a fire or more violations would suddenly appear. Despite these stressors, I kept pushing forward, meeting with neighbors, gathering their testimonies about witnessing suspicious boundary changes. Some had old photographs showing the farmland from decades ago, including where the fences and boundary stones originally stood. Others described how Diane had approached them, trying to buy their land, and how relentless she was in her efforts. Each conversation revealed new angles of the HOA's manipulations. Meanwhile, my lawyer Martha was gathering all of it, preparing for the legal showdown that was looming on the horizon. The tension in the community started to peak, especially when a few brave families declared they would stand with me in court. As the days rolled on, I could see the frantic pace of construction. Workers were rushing to install walls, roofs, plumbing, everything needed to finalize these houses. They knew that if they could complete and sell them to unsuspecting buyers, it would be infinitely harder for me to have them removed or demolished. Someone was gambling that I'd run out of money or patience before the legal system could catch up to the truth. But they had no idea how stubborn I was prepared to be, or that my grandfather had given me the seeds of a plan that would eventually force them to see they had walked right into a carefully laid trap. During one of my late-night reading sessions of my grandfather's notebook, I noticed a curious remark. Should they build anything on land that isn't theirs, their entire investment becomes vulnerable. He'd scrawled references to specific state statutes and old property laws about invalid conveyances. In essence, if the HOA built on land they didn't truly own, they could lose everything, especially if the rightful owner pressed charges for damages and trespassing. It struck me that perhaps my grandfather guessed this scenario might happen and deliberately held back on confronting them until they were in so deep that their entire scheme would collapse once the truth emerged. The more they built, the more they committed themselves to a property that wasn't actually theirs. In short, the bigger they made this project, the bigger their ultimate downfall could be. That realization gave me a twisted sense of satisfaction. Still, it was a risky strategy because it required letting the situation escalate to a point of no return. I decided to consult a local surveyor, a man named Leonard Jacobs, who had a reputation for honesty and a careful eye. I showed him the documents, the markers I'd found, and the suspicious ones at the county office. After a few days of on-site measurements, Leonard confirmed that the line used by the HOA was indeed incorrect. He explained how property corners are supposed to be reconfirmed if there's any doubt, and how surveyors must verify older markers. The markers you found are definitely older and more credible, he said, and it looks like the new documents were drafted by someone who either didn't read them carefully or deliberately shifted the boundary. Armed with his official survey report, I felt the strongest I had since coming back to town. Now, it wasn't just my grandfather's notes. We had a modern professional survey that stood in direct contradiction to the HOA's claims. Meanwhile, Diane and her cohorts stepped up their intimidation tactics. I began finding threatening letters stuffed in my mailbox, telling me to drop the lawsuit or face dire consequences. My truck tires were slashed one evening after I visited a neighbor who was helping me gather old photos. The sheriff, who had always been friendly in my childhood, seemed cagey whenever I reported these incidents, as if his hands were tied by some unspoken chain of influence. It felt like a small war was brewing right here in rural Missouri, with the future of my family's farm at the heart of it. But my neighbors, the ones who believed in justice, rallied around me. Some offered to stand guard at night, while others brought in more historical documents or personal statements. Each time the HOA ramped up their aggression, my resolve hardened. I wasn't alone, and I was drawing strength from the community's unity. As time went on, I caught whispers of an upcoming community meeting hosted by the HOA. Though these meetings usually covered mundane topics like lawn care standards or the neighborhood watch, this particular gathering had gained a ton of attention because of the controversy around the housing development on what many suspected was stolen land. Diane, obviously, wanted to spin the narrative in her favor, claiming that the project would bring economic growth and new families to the area. She likely hoped to dismiss me as a troublemaker who was out to sabotage the community's progress. but I saw it as the perfect chance to confront her publicly. My attorney Martha agreed, seeing it as a preview of the bigger legal clash to come. On the night of the HOA meeting, the usually sleepy town hall was packed to the rafters with concerned citizens, local officials, some of the new homeowners who had already put money down on the uncompleted houses, and, of course, me and my supporters. Diane stood at the front exuding an air of forced confidence, trying to maintain her composure. She began with a polished speech about community, growth, and how the Glendale Park HOA had always aimed to improve local living standards. It sounded scripted, and the crowd's mood seemed divided. Some nodded in agreement, but many others stood with arms crossed, looking skeptical. Once Diane finished, she opened the floor for questions. That's when things got heated. I stepped forward holding a folder of evidence. My heart pounded, but I was fueled by righteous anger. I asked her directly, "Can you provide a legitimate explanation for why your housing project is encroaching on my inherited farmland, which I never sold or consented to give up?" A hush fell over the audience. Diane tried to smirk in that condescending way she often did. "We have the records," she declared. "We purchased that land. It's unfortunate that you're confused, but we've followed every legal procedure. Perhaps you should double-check your inheritance documents." She must have thought I'd just go away after that, but I didn't. Right then and there, I began pulling out the newly done professional survey, my grandfather's maps, and the documentation of the original boundary stakes. The entire room seemed to shift in atmosphere. People leaned in, straining to see the papers. I explained step by step how the property lines on the county records had been altered and how the older, legally recognized markers proved the HOA's claim was bogus. Diane's face tightened. She tried to interrupt me, insisting my evidence was forged or incomplete. That's when Martha calmly stepped forward, referencing the official survey Leonard Jacobs had done. "The methodology behind this survey is standard in the state of Missouri," she said, her voice echoing through the room. "There's no error here, and we have sworn affidavits from local residents who remember the boundary lines from decades ago. This is the genuine property limit, and everything beyond it is illegally constructed on my client's land." Members of the crowd started murmuring. Some were outraged, others looked worried, especially those who had already bought one of the nearly completed homes. A local news reporter snapped photos, sensing a big story. Diane's composure cracked. She tried to pivot, attacking me personally. "This is a deliberate attempt to block the community's development. The farm is in disrepair and we're trying to bring in new life. Why do you want to destroy progress?" But the more she spoke, the more transparent her desperation became. People began questioning her about the sudden speed of the project's approval, the large sums of money changing hands, and her personal connections to the planning board. By the time the meeting ended, the crowd was in an uproar. Local officials were suddenly backpedaling, promising they'd review all the evidence. Diane left in a huff. The tide was turning. The next big event was the official court hearing scheduled a few weeks later. This was where everything would be decided, whether I could secure a permanent injunction to halt construction, and whether the county would formally restore the deed to reflect the actual boundaries. Diane arrived with a small army of lawyers who wore expensive suits and had the air of big city legal hotshots. I could tell they were prepared to bombard us with technicalities, but as soon as the judge saw the overwhelming evidence, the older deed references, the professional survey, the testimonies from longtime neighbors, he seemed skeptical of the HOA's claims. When one of Diane's lawyers tried to argue that my documents were outdated, we countered with a demonstration of how property lines are never considered outdated unless they're lawfully changed, and in this case, there was no legitimate change. A key moment came when the judge asked why no official notice was given to me about the alleged sale. Under Missouri law, I should have been notified if any land transfer was taking place on property I rightfully owned. The HOS lawyers stumbled around the question, offering vague references to attempted mail correspondence. That was the opening we needed. Martha presented proof that no such notice ever reached me. It became painfully obvious that someone had falsified the transfer documents, likely forging signatures or sneaking them through channels Diane had influence over. After several tense hours, the judge granted an immediate injunction, stopping construction cold. He also ordered an investigation into the fraudulent land transfer. People in the gallery burst into applause. Diane looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. The judge further remarked that if the investigation confirmed the fraud, not only would the HOA have to tear down what they had built, but they might also owe me compensation for damages and legal fees. It was a monumental shift. The houses, 96 in total, that the HOA had been so proud of were suddenly worthless if they sat on stolen land. Diane's empire was crumbling. In the weeks that followed, local officials, embarrassed by the scandal, distanced themselves from Diane. Some of her strongest supporters resigned from the HOA board. A few even publicly apologized to me, claiming they'd been misled about the legality of the project. The tension in town eased dramatically. My farmland was returned to its rightful status, and the judge's order forced the HOA to dismantle or relocate certain structures that had already been built. Many of the nearly completed homes were abandoned mid-construction. The financial fallout for the HOA was staggering. Contractors demanded payment for work done, prospective buyers demanded refunds, and Diane found herself at the center of a legal storm that included potential criminal charges for land fraud. Throughout this process, I oversaw the gradual cleanup of the farmland. Many neighbors, feeling inspired by the victory, volunteered their time and resources to help me. Broken fences were repaired, the overgrown fields were cleared of debris from the construction sites, and people started discussing ways to preserve the land's natural beauty. Where there had once been discord, a sense of solidarity blossomed. The local news covered the story extensively, highlighting how a single individual had stood up against a powerful HOA and won. It was the kind of tale that gave people hope, living proof that justice could prevail when backed by courage and community support. As for Diane, she faced both legal and social consequences. The district attorney took an interest in the case, and charges of fraud and conspiracy loomed. Diane's close connections to certain officials came under scrutiny, leading to internal investigations. Suddenly, those who had been in her pocket were either resigning or cutting ties with her. She had nowhere left to turn, and the fallout was brutal. The once intimidating figurehead of Glendale Park HOA had become a pariah in the very town she tried to dominate. The last I heard, she was desperately trying to negotiate a plea deal to avoid jail time. In the aftermath, I took a long walk across the restored farmland. Standing by the creek where we'd found the iron stakes, I could almost feel my grandfather's presence, smiling at me with pride. The entire ordeal had been exhausting and terrifying, yet it carried a strange sense of poetic justice. All along, my grandfather had anticipated that unscrupulous individuals might try to snatch away our family's heritage. He'd left me the documents and set up the perfect trap. Not in a malicious sense, but in the sense that all the lies and fraudulent deals would inevitably collapse once the truth was revealed. The HOA had built 96 homes on my land, but in doing so, they'd only cemented their own downfall. It was a bittersweet moment of triumph, and also a reminder of how much power can be wielded by manipulative people when no one dares stand against them. Eventually, the community rallied to preserve the farmland, turning part of it into a protected area for local wildlife and a place for neighborhood kids to learn about nature. We also used a portion of the land to create a small, sustainable garden where families could grow fresh produce. That was the final nail in the coffin of Diane's old agenda. The area she'd tried to commercialize and turn into cookie-cutter houses was now a testament to community collaboration and environmental respect. People from neighboring towns came to see what we had accomplished, and they left inspired by how quickly a negative situation could be turned around with unity and perseverance. A few months after the dust settled, we organized a town barbecue at the farm. We set up tables near the old barn, and everyone contributed food, drinks, and good cheer. Children chased each other through the fields, dogs barked happily, and the older folks reminisced about how things had changed so drastically in such a short time. I took a moment to thank my neighbors for standing by me. It hadn't been easy for any of us, and some had risked a lot by speaking out against the HOA. Their bravery exemplified the best of small-town spirit, reminding me why my grandfather had cherished this land and these people so dearly. Martha, my lawyer, gave a toast, commending me on my determination and praising the community for showing that truth can prevail over greed when good people stand together. As she spoke, my eyes wandered to the horizon where a red-gold sunset bathed the field in warm light. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt truly at peace. I knew the fight was worth it. I knew my grandfather's legacy was intact, and maybe even stronger than before. This land was more than a piece of property. It was a living story of family, community, and justice. The final resolution in court confirmed the fraud, awarding me not only the land, but also compensatory damages that Diane and the HOA were liable for. I used part of that money to pay back my legal expenses and to invest in improving the farm. We restored the farmhouse, turning it into a charming, functional home again. I considered moving back full-time, but I also knew I had roots in Chicago. In the end, I decided to split my time between the city and the farm. Whenever I was in town, the doors were open to friends and neighbors, and we made sure the farmland remained a community centerpiece. By the end of that year, the story had turned into something of a local legend. People still talk about the big flashy housing project that tried to bulldoze its way onto farmland and got stopped by the rightful owner's fierce resolve. They laugh about how the HOA built 96 homes without realizing they were walking straight into a trap laid decades earlier by a wise old farmer who suspected wrongdoing might occur. Kids sometimes ask me if we're going to open a museum in the old barn, chronicling the battle for the farm. I'm not entirely sure about that, but part of me thinks my grandfather would love the idea of keeping a record, not just of the land, but of the victory that preserved it. One hot afternoon, as I was rummaging through some of my grandfather's old belongings, I stumbled upon a letter he'd never sent. It was addressed to me, written when I was still a teenager, and it read, "This farm will always be part of who you are. When trouble comes, stand your ground. Trust in the goodness of the people around you and never let fear drive you away from doing what's right. This land has a spirit that only grows stronger when challenged." Reading that brought tears to my eyes. It felt like he was still guiding me, even now. I folded the letter gently, placed it with his notebook, and smiled. He'd always believed in the power of honest community. That's exactly what had saved us all. The moral of this long, complicated journey is something I want everyone to hold on to. It's not just about knowing your rights or having the right documents, though those are crucial in a legal sense. It's about the collective strength that comes from unity, determination, and a refusal to be bullied by those who exploit power. No matter how influential your opponents might seem, no matter how many connections they have, if you stand firmly on the side of truth and gather genuine allies who believe in justice, you can topple what seems insurmountable. So if you ever find yourself in a similar fight, whether it's over property, principle, or basic fairness, remember this: you're never as alone as you think you are, and the truth has a way of shining through the darkest deceptions when good people come together. By the time everything was resolved, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and fulfillment. I learned an invaluable lesson. Sometimes you can only protect what's precious to you by refusing to be intimidated, even when every outward sign suggests you should give up. The road back to my family's farmland brought me face to face with greed, corruption, and abuse of power, but it also reconnected me with the best parts of my hometown. The loyalty, the warmth, the readiness of ordinary people to stand up for what's right when asked. There, in those open fields and under that endless sky, I found not just a reason to fight, but a reason to believe in something bigger than myself. It's the same reason my grandfather always cherished that land. It's a place where the seeds of faith, justice, and unity can grow into something that outlasts any storm. If that's not a testament to the enduring power of righteousness, I don't know what is. And so, in the end, they built 96 homes on my land, never suspecting that every nail and every foundation was reinforcing the trap my grandfather and I, in our own ways, had set. The best part? The real victory isn't the court order or the demolished houses or even the financial payout. It's the knowledge that a small community, armed with truth and solidarity, can overcome intimidation and greed. When I walk through those fields now, I feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude. I hear my grandfather's voice whispering in the wind, reminding me that the power of a family's legacy isn't measured in acres or titles, but in the love, honesty, and courage we sow into the ground. And that is a harvest no amount of money or underhanded plotting can ever take away.